welcome to another session of History by Lou. And we're going to take a look at was America really perfect in the 1950s? And so while you listen to this, I want you to ask yourself three questions. Was it really a fake image, or was America really a better place during the 1950s? Second question is, why was civil rights so long delayed and we finally began to deal with it, but only a little bit in the 1950s? Why did it take so long? And the final question is, were the 1950s a good time and can we repeat them? Or was it a one-time only kind of experience? So as you listen to this and watch this, make sure you ask yourself those questions. All right, let's get on with it. We're going to tackle the Eisenhower years, 1953 to 1961. When somebody recently has been saying, when America was perfect. Well, really, no, America was far from perfect at that time, even though some people are nostalgic for those years. So there are some themes that we'll look at from 46 to 61, four main themes. First of all, we're going to take a little look at the Cold War, which was beginning during this period. Were we a confident nation after we had won World War II? And then consumerism, which begins to really rear its head in many, many ways. And then the civil rights movement, which really begins in the 1950s and really takes off in the 1960s. Was it a time of happy days or anxiety, alienation, and social unrest? We're going to let you be the judge. So first of all, we have to take a look at Dwight David Eisenhower. His nickname was Ike. He was born October 14th, 1890 in Texas, Abilene, Texas. He died in 1969 in Washington, D.C. He was a graduate of West Point. He was Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, and he was our 34th president, Republican, from 1953 to 1961. His vice president was Richard Nixon, who will later go on to be president himself. The issues of and events of this time included civil rights. Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned. Public schools begin to be integrated, though it's going to take quite a while. Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to ride the bus in the back. Montgomery bus strike that results from it, the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., and the Little Rock Nine. Now here are some issues of the Cold War that we really won't touch on today, but we'll get to in a later session. But this is when the Korean War is ended. The Suez Canal, which many people have forgotten about, the uprising in Hungary, Berlin, Sputnik in 1957, the U-2 spy plane. Domestic policy is what we're going to focus on today. Balanced and moderate, that was Eisenhower. Bland, leading the bland, somebody call it. Overall, it was a time of great prosperity. The New Deal of a modern life. Expanded farm aid, expanded Social Security and housing and health services. We have the Highway Act of 1956, which begins the interstate highway system. 42,000 miles of interstate highways linking major cities. And it's a time when we improve our national defense. And we have good jobs, we have trucking, bad for the poor public transportation. When we look at 1950s U.S., we had lots of federal highways. Notice that tremendous number of red lines that run all over the country, but they were slow and they were tedious to drive on. And so Eisenhower saw a need for something different, and that will become the interstate highway system. The American society through the 1950s. This is a famous picture. We were returning to peacetime after we had solved the problem of World War II. Truman and the civil rights. One of the major acts Harry Truman made as president came in 1948 when Truman made an executive order to end segregation in the armed forces. Truman asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill that would make lynching a federal crime. Lynching at this time was still happening in many places. The GI Bill came about in 1944. It's called the Serviceman's Readjustment Act. We had 17 million people who wound up in uniform during World War II, and they knew as early as 1944 that they were going to return home, and they were going to have to find a way to deal with them. So this act provided for education for people, unemployment compensation, something new, low-cost home loans, low-cost business loans, and it spurred the growth of the economy in the 1950s. Many people began to move to the Sun Belt, those states that are California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida. That move continued after World War II because of air conditioning, and the defense industries were located there, and they were employing a lot of people. It spurred the movement and the development. We were an affluent society. There was a great economic boom that began in 1950 and was going to last through till 1970. The national income doubled in each decade. Politics of the era? Well, first of all, we had the election of 1948. And during that election, Harry Truman prevails. And then 4 years later, the election of 1952, in which the Republicans prevail, and we have a new president, President Dwight David Eisenhower. The election of 1948 had really three candidates. It had Harry Truman, who was seeking election. He had succeeded the presidency when Roosevelt had died, but he hadn't won his own term, so wants to win his own term. Thomas Dewey, the Republican governor of New York, and Strom Thurmond, who was the governor of, who was going to run for president as a Dixiecrat. Truman angered many Southern Democrats by supporting desegregation, which was still a law of the land. Many didn't think he was going to be reelected. Many people hated Harry Truman during this period. People were so sure that Truman would lose that one headline, and you see the picture of it, even one headline would even incorrectly say that Dewey has won. This was the Chicago Daily Tribune. Dewey defeats Truman. Of course, it was not true. Historians view the election of 1948 as the greatest election upset in American history. It's also Southern Democrats leave the National Party in response to Truman's support for civil rights, and this is when Hubert Humphrey speaks to the convention in 1948, and he calls for a civil rights platform. And of course, at that time, the Democratic Party relied on the South for support. Strom Thurmond was the South Carolina governor. He decided he was going to run for president on his own, but he was going to call himself a Dixiecrat and not a Democrat. The Dixiecrats were Southern Democrats who backed racial segregation and limited voting rights of African Americans. It was a continuation of Jim Crow and slavery. The party was also known as the States' Rights Party. Thomas Dewey, the New York governor, ran for the Republicans. Truman appeared to lose, but appeals to the people during the Do-Nothing Republican Congress, and he won the election. He went across the country in a train campaigning against the Do-Nothing Republican Congress, and it worked. And it was true that Congress had not done very much. Truman called his program the Fair Deal, called it in 1949, a program of social improvement. Continuation of the New Deal with a minimum wage, increased rights for African Americans, national health insurance. His major success was the Housing Act of 1949 and the minimum wage. Then we have the 22nd Amendment in 1951. We had elected Roosevelt 4 times, and people said, no, never again. We're not going to elect a president multiple times. And so we ratify finally the 22nd Amendment in 1951. And what does it say? It limits the president to 2 terms or 10 years maximum. It did not apply to Harry Truman, however. He could have run for another term if he had chosen to do so. What it really says is you could be elected to 2 terms, and if you serve as vice president and succeed to the presidency for 1 day less than half of the term, you can then run for 2 terms of your own, or a total of 10 years. If it's 1 day over half of a term when you succeed to the presidency, you can only run for 1 term of your own. The conservative move out because of 17 years of Democratic control. Now, in the election of 1952, Truman decided that he was not going to seek election as a second term. He could have, because this act did not apply to him. But Eisenhower, the popular World War II Supreme Allied commander, he won the election. And he becomes the first Republican president elected since the Depression. This is the ad that's very famous for Eisenhower. You need to hear
for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. We make like you, Washington. We don't want John or Harry. Let's do that big job right. Let's get it up with the guys. Let's get it up with you. You like I like I. Everybody likes I for president. We make like you, Washington. We got to get we are going now all day. I for president. Can't take all the other way. We all go with us. You like I like it. I for president. We'll make I do Washington. We'll make I do Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
Now, this was a very primitive ad at that time, but television was in its infancy and just beginning to explode across the country. Eisenhower called his program dynamic conservatism. Ike's policy, conserving money while still providing for citizens. Increased Social Security and the minimum wage. Now, Social Security was a creation of the New Deal under Roosevelt, and it was very unpopular to begin with Republicans, but now it had become institutionalized. He created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1953, and he tried very hard. He really did, to balance the budget, reducing farm subsidies and reducing defense spending, but it really didn't work out very well. Eisenhower is noted for his Eisenhower matrix. How did this man who led us to victory in World War II and then served as president, how did he make decisions? He had a matrix that he used, and it had a scale of importance on one side and one of urgency on the other scale, and it had 4 quadrants. If it was do it now, it was rank number 1. It was urgent and important. You do it now. If it's important but it's not urgent, then you decide when to do it. If it is urgent but not important, delegate it. Get somebody else to do it. And finally, if it's not important and it's not urgent, then you delete it and you just move on. It was an important decision-making process, and it could be used by anyone in any field of endeavor. 1954 saw the Brown versus the Board of Education. Previously, the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson decided to have separate but equal education in this country. Oliver Brown applied his daughter to a school that wasn't far from their home, but it was a white school. His daughter had to walk very far to go to a school that would accept her. Brown took this case to the court, saying it was indeed separate, but far from being equal. The Supreme Court unanimously wound up ruling in favor of Brown. This is also the period when Alaska and Hawaii become states. Alaska had been bought in 1867 from Russia for about $7 million. It was facilitated by Stewart, the Secretary of State at that time, and it was called Stewart's Folly. Hawaii was annexed by the U.S. in 1898 under questionable circumstances. Both Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the U.S. as states in 1959. One tended to be conservative, the other tended to be liberal, and so it was a trade-off we were going to get one liberal and one conservative state in the same year, 1959. Alaska became the 49th state and Hawaii becoming the 50th state. So this is also a time when we have a changing workplace. I have to talk for a little bit about the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. It's still in effect. It's a response. There were numerous strikes after World War II. See, people have been very patriotic during World War II. They had avoided going on strike and protesting, but as soon as World War II was solved, they went on strike in many, many industries, and 5 million of our country, of then probably 160 million people, went on strike. It was a big deal. And this act gave government more control over the unions. There was, first of all, one provision was a 60-day wait period. It outlawed closed shops, and states could regulate union shops. Taft-Hartley Act was hated by the labor unions. It had added 6 new unfair labor practices to the National Labor Relations Act, prohibiting unions from engaging in activities such as jurisdictional strikes, wildcat strikes, solidarity or political strikes, secondary boycotts, or secondary and mass picketing. Closed shops is a significant turning point in the history of labor laws in the United States, marking a shift towards a more employer-friendly and anti-union environment, and Taft-Hartley is still in effect. The federal law greatly restricted the activities and power of labor unions. Closed shops became illegal. Businesses could hire non-union workers. A union shop could only exist after a vote of the majority of the employees. No more jurisdictional strikes and secondary boycotts. Employers have the right to be exempted from bargaining with unions. So you didn't have to belong to a union. You might have to pay their dues or their expenses of their working on your behalf to gain a wage increase, but that was it. Another labor issue in the 1950s was the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merger in 1955. Originally, the CIO had been part of the AFL, and the AFL was the American Federation of Labor, the unions of skilled craft workers. But in the early 30s, there were people who wanted to belong to the union who were not in a skilled craft. And so they organized this CIO. And the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, welcomed unskilled and semi-skilled factory workers. But the two were floundering by the 1950s because of the Taft-Hartley Act and other actions. And so the two agreed that they were going to join together in 1955, and they have been together ever since. They were going to run into problems, however, because of one of the subgroups of the AFL, and that is Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. I mentioned the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959. This was Ike's response to Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. It tightened government control over unions. All unions suffered because of this, and membership in unions declined. A federal law to address corruption and autocratic practices within labor unions in the United States. And there were a lot of them. These labor unions became like great big mafia organizations. The act was a response to widespread publicity about corruption and abuse of power within certain American labor unions during the 1950s. They weren't all guilty of this, but some surely were. The Landrum-Griffin Act had key provisions. The Landrum-Griffin Act aims to promote democratic procedures within the labor organizations by, number one, granting certain rights to union members, including the right to access union records and financial information. Establishing reporting requirements for labor organizations, union officers, and employers. Mandating the regular election of union officers. Safeguarding labor organization funds and assets. And protecting union members from unfair practices by unions. Oh, yes, and then during this period, we have the baby boom. There was a great, substantial increase in the birth rate from 1946 to 1964. It seems to me that every other young household I see is pregnant, a British visitor to America said in 1958. In a graph, you see that it just kept increasing year by year by year. It was very normal to have a family of 3 and 4 and more children. 1957, there was one baby born every 7 seconds. Then we have suburban living that comes about in this period. Suburbia, something new we've never had before. Following the communist paranoia of World War II, more and more Americans began to conform to the idealistic 1950s family. The man was supposed to be the provider of the home. The woman was going to be the caregiver, taking care of the household. And the children we expected to be disciplined and studious. See, this was the perfect American. Another way for a family to guarantee their conformist image was to live in suburbia. Bill Levitt most famously created what we know as Levittown in New Jersey. It was a suburban region where homes all looked identical and were a specified spacing from neighbors. 18 houses could be built in the morning and 18 at night, all in the same style. The streets were alphabetical. $100 down payment, one-story home. Levittown, New York was called the American Dream. It helped to solve a housing shortage, which led to this planning of mass producing of suburban communities. 1949, William Levitt began to produce 150 houses per week. They sold for just under $8,000, priced at $58 a month. With $90 down payment, and you would have a house to live in. The new American dream, and they were cute. They were just small little houses. They did have a double fireplace, a kitchen, a living room, and 2 bedrooms, and a nice bath. They were 1 story high, a 12 by 19 living room, which was fairly spacious. They had 2 lovely bedrooms, a tiled bathroom, a garage, would you believe, a small backyard, a front lawn, and would you know it, by 1960, 1/3 of the U.S. population was living in the suburbs. And they were cute little houses, just nice little bungalows, nice looking houses. And there's one after the other. They weren't much different. One was pretty much the same as the rest. And they have now been added to over the years. So if you went into one today, it wouldn't look exactly like it did back then, but they're the basis for houses. Central cities and in 1940, 50, 60, and 70 all had about the same proportion of population in this country. About 31, 32% of the population lived in central cities. In the suburbs, 1940, only about 20% lived there, but by 1970, over 40%, it doubled. Over 40% of the people lived in suburbs. It's a big shift. Rural areas and small towns were almost 50% in 1940, and they were down to about 26% by 1970. A big shift in our American population between those 30 years. And so it strengthened the idea of the nuclear family as the model for American life. Consumerism began during this period. Spend, spend, spend. Money saved in World War II was ready to be spent. And there was more disposable income because incomes were going up and increased spending. So all babies were potential consumers who spearheaded a brand new market for food, clothing, and shelter. Americans were buying new products that would modernize their lives. They had something new in our world called planned obsolescence. The goods were going to wear out. So when they wear out, you don't fix them, you just get a new one. Whether it's televisions or it's radios or it's Tupperware or the fashion of the time. There was a definite consumer culture that developed. There was a growth in consumer culture and military industrial complex causing the United States to reach its peak of success of American capitalism. The economy grew by 37%, and the GI Bill, which gave military veterans affordable access to a college education, afforded a productive pool of now highly educated employees to the workforce. The Diners Club card, something new that had come along, was limited to paying for meals to begin with at a limited number of restaurants. But it was quickly discovered that other cards could do the same thing and be expanded. So this touched off a dramatic growth in borrowing. Private debt more than doubled from 104.8 billion to 263.3 billion dollars. New house cost $8,450, and by 1959 it had grown to 12,400. A gallon of gas was, would you believe this, 18 cents, and by 1959 it was 25 cents. The average cost of a new car was $1,510, and by 1959 was $2,200. Don't you wish those days were back, huh? Except that the inflation has made that really be about the same as things are today. Toilet tissue was only about 5 cents. There were technological breakthroughs. This is when mainframe computers began to do their thing. Personal computers come later, but the mainframe computers were there. Airlines developed into major transportation vehicles, which they had not been up until then. Now we began to fly instead of taking the train or going by car. Televisions, almost none of them in 1950, had exploded by 1960. And different kinds of camera inventions came along, including the Polaroid. And lots of transistors began to be used. The first time transistors became widely used in many different products. There were many new inventions. 1950, the Diners Club card that I already mentioned sparked a rise in consumer buying, but it sometimes led to Americans spending more than they had, something that's continued to today. The very beginnings of color TV, which really was going to take off in the 1960s, but it was beginning during this period. 1951, superglue, would you believe, originally discovered as early as 1942 when searching for materials to make guns, was rejected initially for its ability to stick to everything. However, it was reintroduced in 1951 and sold commercially by 1958, and we all use it. The first videotape recorders began to appear during this period. And then, do you remember this? 1952, Mr. Potato Head, he's still around. The barcode, which led to the UPC, the Uniform Product Code, helped create faster customer service, better track of products, increased checkout, and assist customer self-checkout. 1953, radial tires appear. Michelin premiered this, revolutionized world tire market, minimized tread wear, and belts of steel fibers around the circumference helped to stabilize the tire, making them safer in addition to going much further. 1954, McDonald's appears, the first franchised outside of California by Ray Kroc, led to the rise of other fast food companies such as Burger King and Pizza Hut, and I could go on and on and on and on. Swanson TV dinners, time saving, less time in the kitchen, more time for TV. 1956, Mistake Out, invented by an artist turned secretary. She saw how expensive ink was to fix mistakes. She created Mistake Out to correct errors. By 1957, she owned her own multi-million-dollar business. Cost saver for typists. Remember this? 1958, the hula hoop, used as a hobby but also as a form of competition. It led to the World Hula Hoop Championships of 1968. 1959, our friend Barbie doll, invented by Mattel. Full fictional name is Barbara Millicent Roberts. Did you know that? She wound up in a relationship with her compadre, Ken Carson, in 1961. There were novels published about this from Random House. Became one of the most beloved dolls of all time, and she's still around. Music. Rock and roll was created as a counterculture event to the conformity of the 1950s. It helped to develop from a blend of styles such as the Southern blues and gospel music. It was popular with teenagers, occurred in relevance to the Great Migration as 6 million African Americans came to the North and West from 1916 to 1970, bringing Southern blues with them. Memphis record producer Sam Phillips found our hero Elvis Presley. And then there was this guy. Elvis Presley, by the way, became known as the king of rock and roll with his hip thrusts and ducktail hairstyle, showing that Americans weren't afraid to be different. But this music was banned from radio stations and schools. Then there was Jerry Lee Lewis. Remember him with great balls of fire? He was a Christian boy turned rock and roller. His career hit a downfall when he married his 13-year-old cousin. Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock, appeared in this period. Frank Sinatra gained ears of the parents. He had a contract with Capitol Records from 1953 and had a mature jazz sound. He popularized The Way You Look Tonight. But this is what he had to say about rock and roll. In 1957, Frank Sinatra said, "It is the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression. Lewd, sly, in plain fact, dirty, a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac, and the martial music of every side-burned delinquent on the face of the earth." He didn't like it. And then we have culture of the car. Cars became the center of the new lifestyle of the 1950s. Remember those big fins on the 1958 and 59 Cadillac and other cars? There was the 1950s Corvette. So this is a 1959 Chevy Corvette. The Corvette was a very popular car, and it still is today. Car registrations in 1945, there were 25 million of them. By 1960, it had increased to 60 million. Two-family cars doubled between 1951 and 1958. Who knew you needed two cars? Initially, even having one was a miracle to begin with. Drive-in culture we had, America became a more uniform nation with franchise businesses because of the automobile. There was, of course, the first McDonald's in 1955, 15-cent hamburgers to begin with. And it's still around. Howard Johnson's, of course, it spread all over the country. It had food and it had housing. And then there were drive-in movies all over the place. That was the way to go. You sat in your car and watched a movie. It was a time of change. Although the 1950s was a time when it seemed like everything changed. Fashions, values, morals, and entertainment was transformed from conservative to more liberal, especially with the civil rights movement that was going to explode in the 1960s. People created inventions that made things seem easier to do and allowed much more free time. People were able to explore new things, and that's what brought about the counterculture as well as the violence many would witness. And so that's the end of part one. But I want you to stay tuned because we're going to take a look at the 1950s that have a lot more that happened, a lot more in the culture. And then at some point, we'll take a look at the foreign affairs that took place during this time, a big change for everybody in the world. And so once again, I thank you for listening. I want you to hit the subscribe and like buttons so I can be encouraged to create more History by Lou just for you. So I thank you for listening today, and I look forward to being with you for the next presentation.